Get going here. We are continuing our study on Daniel chapter 11. It's been a couple weeks because we had current events class last week, so we might do just a little bit of catch up and then we'll go from there. In terms of the expositor's book, we are kind of on like page 211, or sorry, not 211, 311, going on to 312. If anybody wants to look at that to kind of just get themselves situated, and I'll try and just do a basic rundown of where we got to last time. So let me just go back here. Okay, so kind of the last verse in Daniel 11 that we had left off with last time was Daniel 11 verse 20. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just go to Daniel and kind of just like look at the section of verses there, and then I kind of want to just go through Daniel 11 verse 20 again, since it's been a little while and it's a short verse. Then everybody's kind of caught up to like who the players are, where we are, all that kind of stuff. So let me just flip to Daniel 11 quickly. Okay, so if we look at Daniel 11, we kind of have from about verse, where did we start here? Verse like 10, 11, all the way to 20 is kind of talking about the same main guy. Okay, and that's the king of the north at that time. Now, does anybody kind of remember who the king of the north at that time was from the past number of verses that we were just reading? It's okay if you don't, because there's a lot of people with the same name. I totally understand. You're right. Which one? Because there's like 17.
That's a safe answer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not Antiochus. It's probably totally. Yeah. Okay. So the king of the north, or the Antiochus, you're absolutely right. From verses kind of like 10 all the way down to 20 is Antiochus the Great. Also Antiochus III. I meant to hand out these. You guys do me a favor and kind of just disperse those 2 by 2. Pretend it's the arcade. So like that. Okay, so the Antiochus from that section of verses is Antiochus the Great, or the third. If you look on these papers that I'm kind of handing out, under the Seleucid rulers, I believe he's the last king on that front page. So I don't know if anybody can see that or not, but yeah. Yeah, right down there. So there's, yeah, the Seleucid rulers at the top of the page, and he'll be the last king.
We need to categorize those.
Those are two.
There is 2. There's a Ptolemy one, there's a
Okay.
Seleucid one.
All right.
Sorry, I don't have lots of them, but so I'll try and share best I can.
All right. So what did you just do? You need more, I think.
Okay, that's fine. As long as like when somebody gets referenced, we can kind of share around and look at who's who. So the king of the north during those section of verses is Antiochus the Great. Now where we had kind of got to last time is like right at the very end of him. And then it's going to be kind of his sons and who's involved with that on this next part. And that kind of ends in verse 19 and 20, so maybe I'll just back up even slightly more. So verse 18 and 19 is like the end of Antiochus, and then at the very end of verse 19 it says, he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And I don't know if anybody remembers when I was saying how he died, but basically he got beaten by Rome. Rome gave him this peace treaty that was, he had to pay like lots of money, and one of his house had to like go and live in Rome as a hostage during that time. He goes back to Syria, and then he starts to go on campaign in some other countries to try and raise taxes, and he gets killed in some like little known place way off in Persia. So like this great mighty king is killed by some random guy while he's raiding a temple. Not on some great battlefield, not in some fancy execution. That's just the end of him. So verse 20, when we get there, says, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. So if we kind of just break down this one verse, because it's a transition verse, we go from one king who's been a really major player to another one, but he dies very quickly. So the then shall stand up in his estate, that is Antiochus the Great. So somebody is standing up in his house to kind of take over his kingdom when he dies. Now we don't know too much about this guy, and he really doesn't last too long. But we do know that he's a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed. So as far as we can tell, looking at the history, this guy who stands up in his estate is his son, and his name is Seleucus Philopter. You don't really need to remember his name too much, because there's a lot of Seleucuses as well, and it's hard to keep track of them all. But what we don't really get in this verse is kind of the backstory about how all this occurs. So this son of his comes to the throne and he takes over, and he reigns for about 11 years, so a little more than a few days than kind of what is suggested in Scripture, and I don't know if there's kind of an interpretation of that would help us understand why the few days is stretched out into 11 years, but that's generally who we can figure who it was. And as far as we can tell, he is, he's not killed in battle, he's not anything, but he's poisoned by the right-hand guy of the king. So when Antiochus dies, his son Seleucus Philopater takes over as king of the Seleucids and the symbolic king of the north. He inherits the kingdom not as like the great kingdom of the Seleucids as it's beaten, but a kingdom of the Seleucids that's just been beaten by Rome. It is paying a whole bunch of taxes to Rome and all these things, and he reigns only 11 years. But the peace terms have two conditions. The Seleucids have to pay Rome every single year, and one royal family member has to be held in Rome as a hostage. So when he takes the throne, it's actually his brother who is going to go on to become very famous and kind of the main character of the rest of this chapter, Antiochus Epiphanes. So there's him reigning in Syria, and then there's his brother over in Rome. What I'll just do is go over to this map, because it's always nice to look at maps. So at the time, this Seleucus Philopater is over here in Antioch in this yellowy kind of color up here on the screen. Okay, so this is a little bit later on, earlier on, but this is kind of his kingdom that he has. So he's over here. His brother, meanwhile, is being held in Rome as a hostage. And when he comes to the throne, he actually switches out his own son for his brother. He sends his own son to be a hostage in Rome and tells his brother to kind of start to come back, which his brother does. He actually starts to travel, and he's traveling through, and he's in Athens when this next part of the story kind of comes to light. So this Seleucus Philopater is poisoned. Let me just come back here. Right here. He's poisoned by this seemingly random guy who has no role in anything, named Heliodorus. He's just kind of like the finance minister of the Seleucids. But he's sent on a tax collecting mission actually to Jerusalem. And when we read the verse, when it says a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom there kind of means the area of land that brings the most glory or value to the kingdom at the time, which would be Israel. So he sends this finance minister, Heliodorus guy, down to Israel to collect some taxes. According to the Jewish tradition, an angel blocks him from entering the temple and does not allow him to enter or take anything out of the temple. So it says that Seleucus will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. The collector is also referred to as an extortioner or an exactor of tribute. But anyways, Heliodorus comes back after this kind of failed mission, and he poisons Seleucus, or as far as we can figure out, that's what happens. Okay, so there's kind of our where we're at so far. I know I just went through a whole bunch of information really quickly, so I just want to see if anybody has any questions, or just say, I don't know what I don't know. I'll try and go back through it a little bit, but I just kind of want to make sure everybody's sort of on the same page of where we're at. Sorry, I know it's so hard to jump into the middle of this chapter, but Brother Ed?
One earmark that you can put on right about this time is, from chapter 8, it talks about the little horn of the goat beginning to grow. And that is right about this time we're at right now. That's where the Athalids have control over Pergamum, and that's where Rome gets its bequeathment from them and begins to grow through this area. So that this chapter doesn't talk about the little horned goat, but that's the subject matter of chapter 8, and that kind of links the two.
Right. So, and actually, I think it kind of shows this on the screen up here. If you look at this map here, there's a tiny little piece of pink right here.
Yeah.
And this is the Attalids that Brother Ed is talking about. And eventually, this is just given to Rome as like here you can have this piece of land. And from this little portion, Rome begins to grow its influence in Asia Minor, and eventually it kind of uses it as a jumping off point to take over a lot of this area. Brother Sid, you had a little bit question?
No, go ahead.
Somebody else has had one too. Did you have one?
No.
Oh, okay. So this is kind of where we're at now. We have this random Heliodorus guy kind of take over as king of the north. But obviously this doesn't make sense that he would just become the new king of the north, because it's supposed to be Alexander's generals who kind of are the four winds, and it needs to be their family. But you have to remember that he is not, or this guy that was just assassinated was not the only son of Antiochus the Great. We also have this other son over here traveling back, who is kind of looking to come back and take over his father's kingdom from this Heliodorus guy. Okay, so that's not what's, like, when we read verse 20, none of those details are in. It's just like, oh, there's this king and then he dies and it's not in battle, and you're like, okay. But in the meantime, we have all this kind of drama behind the scenes that doesn't really get shown. So now we're kind of moving on, and we want to talk about this Antiochus Epiphanes guy, because he's going to be the main character in the King of the North from about verse 21 to 35. So the rest of the chapter, like the rest of the portion of the chapter where we're talking about the back then King of the North, King of the South, this guy is the King of the North. He is kind of the King of the North that we generally base the interpretation of what the King of the North now is going to be like. Because he's the one that really subjugates and persecutes the Jews more than any other Greek king before him. He's the one that spurs the Maccabean revolt and Judas Maccabeus, which is very well recorded. He also invades Egypt a whole bunch of times and really subdues the Ptolemies. So he is a really important character. And I know kind of in the first part of this chapter, we've been switching back and forth from king to king to king to king really quickly. Now it kind of evens out a little bit more, and we kind of have the same King of the North for a little while, which to me just shows emphasis that this guy is quite important when it comes to the prophecy of the time. And then when we switch in verse 36 kind of to the King of the North and how it's going to be nowadays, it's supposed to be based off of the character traits and the personality of this king and what he did. Yeah, goes it.
So this vile person in, verse 21, that is Antiochus Epiphanes?
No, it's actually
That's
not.
Heliodorus.
So, yeah, that's this
Oh.
Heliodorus guy. So verse 20, we have he shall be destroyed either in anger or in battle. That is this guy right here. This Seleucus Philopater guy. But then, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person. This vile person is this Heliodorus guy who assassinated the king before. So if you want to like Bible mark that, because it is like the tiniest little thing in there. But part of it is, shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. And why? Because he was a totally illegitimate king. He wasn't a descendant of any of the Antiochuses. He wasn't a descendant of the first Seleucus. None of that. So let's kind of keep going here, but we want to keep our eye on this guy right here. Because he's going to become quite important, and he's going to do a lot, not just in terms of fighting back and forth with the other kingdoms like we've seen, but now it's going to kind of focus more in on Israel. This guy specifically targets the Jews and Jerusalem and things like that. Yeah, Gordon?
Well, I think that's why, like, this isn't really written to be a Greek history lesson.
Mm-hmm.
It's from a Jewish perspective again, and from Daniel's perspective.
Right.
So some of the back and forth on the he and him and so forth is kind of like, not that important.
Yeah.
Just
Mm-hmm.
that side of things.
Yeah, and as I've been reading through it, to me, from about verse 5 to now, has kind of just been the pretext of what's going to go on from now on. He's almost kind of just saying, here's the basic history of how we got from like Alexander's generals to this Antiochus Epiphanes guy. Once we get to this Antiochus Epiphanes guy, now we're back to talking about Israel. I've just kind of, or Daniel has just kind of explained, here's the history leading up to this point, now we're back to talking about what goes on with the Jews. And this guy is like the main player of that's going to, push all that forward. Yeah, Bruce?
So, this vile person who is standing up in Seleucus Philopater's estate is in there, he obtains the kingdom by flattery. Where is that brother? Is that brother that's coming back, is that Antiochus?
Yes, it is. And this is kind of one of the tough things about these verses, is they switch who is the he and him in the middle of the verse. It's so confusing. But here's kind of the breakdown of verse 21 to 22 on the screen here. So if we look at that verse, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person. Okay, so who's the his and who is the vile person? The his is this Seleucus Philopater that's just been poisoned. Okay? The vile person, as far as we can tell, and as far as the expositor explains, is this Heliodorus guy who poisoned him. To whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. And the they there is explained by the expositor as, like, the Seleucid kingdom does not give him the honor of the kingdom, because he poisoned this king. He's not a legitimate king, nothing. He kind of just comes in and takes power. But right here, you'll notice there's a colon right here. It changes who the he is that's being talked about, which is the worst. But anyways, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Well, we know that that's not this Heliodorus guy, because he just poisoned the king before him. Like, he's not coming in peaceably, so to speak. So who is this he that comes in peaceably and obtains the kingdom by flatteries? Well, we kind of have to look at the history of that, because the only person that it can be is this Antiochus Epiphanes guy. And the reason for that is when Antiochus Epiphanes is, traveling back to the king of the north and where the Seleucids are, he's in Athens when he hears that this Heliodorus guy has taken over the kingdom. He has no army. He is not known in the Seleucid kingdom because he's been in Rome for the past number of years as a hostage. So he's kind of just coming in as like the returning king, but the returning king that nobody knows because he hasn't really been around. Like the people know of him, but they don't know him personally. He has not been the king.
So he's returning with care.
So he's returning with care, but he also needs an army because Heliodorus is essentially the king of the north at this time, quote unquote, so to speak, who essentially controls the Seleucid army. And this Antiochus Epiphanes guy wants to come back and retake his kingdom, but he has no way to actually do that. So what he does instead is, and we look here, he's in Athens at the time. Now the map looks slightly different than this, but he kind of hangs around out here in Greece for a little while. And he gets in really nice and tight with a lot of the other kings of these small little empires around here. So he gets in close with this king of Pergamon. He gets in close with some of these other Greek states right here. And he eventually convinces them to help him take over his kingdom again, and then he'll be allies with him once he becomes the reinstated king of the north, so to speak. So that's kind of what comes in here, and that he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries, isn't he comes in and tells his own people, peaceably and by flatteries that he should be king. He actually does it with all these other kings, and then they lend him their army, and he marches in and gets rid of this Heliodorus guy, and overtakes his kingdom again. So there's a whole lot of history in this one sentence. But he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. That is the entire story of how Antiochus goes from this outcast who's over in Athens to retake the entire kingdom north in, 12 words. It's kind of interesting. So I'm going to leave it right there for the moment. Does anybody have any questions up to this point?
So Epiphanes is Philopater's brother?
Yeah.
And Antiochus the Great's two sons.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Here, let me just put it on the board here. Even better if I can put it close. There we go. I always feel better with one marker in my hand. Okay, so we have at the very top of the thing, Antiochus the Great, right? This is the guy who fought Rome, and then Rome beat him, and he had to pay all the stuff too, things like that, and he had to send one of his family over to Rome. Then this guy gets killed looting some random temple somewhere, trying to raise taxes to pay off the Romans. And he has two sons. He has Antiochus Epiphanes, and he also has this so he has these two sons, Seleucus Philopater and Antiochus Epiphanes. This one is a hostage. Hopefully everybody can kind of see that, right? He went to Rome. This guy becomes king until he gets poisoned by this.
Helicopter guy.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. Actually, I have a student in my history class who just comes up with names for like all kinds of stuff. So there's this one guy, Maximilien Robespierre. He's like from French Revolution. He just calls him Maximum Rosebush. So helicopter guy, absolutely. If that works for you, 100%. Okay, so this guy, he's coming back, coming back to take his kingdom. In the meantime, from this Heliodorus guy, but he has no army, so he allies himself with all these other kings at the time, and then he takes over.
You kind of pulled an Absalom.
Yes, yes, that's actually a great
Comparison.
thank you. Okay, so helicopter guy dies. Because that other guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, gets this army and these other kings to support him by making peace with them and obtaining it by flatteries. And that's kind of where we're at. So he becomes the new king of the north, which seems like there's so much drama there, and it's just like, oh yeah, and then he became king of the north, and that's it. But anyways, that's kind of where we're at. Any other questions, Brother Ed?
Well, I was going to mention, you talk about the he's and the hims and everything in here, and I think I've mentioned this before, but, you know, the translators have done a wonderful job already, because in the Hebrew, there are no he's and hims or anything like that. You're going to read this direct, and I've been taking Hebrew for the last year. I'm on day 200 now, but it says it would be out estate stands disesteem, no grandeur to dominion, come security, seize dominion, treacherously. That's it.
Wow. So you got
Now,
nothing,
you know,
basically.
how are you going to make that make sense? I'm going to translate that.
So probably the translators would have to have a good idea of history too, and they would have had to been following along with like what is actually happening here to be able to figure out who it's talking about. So thank you to the translators for the he and him. Otherwise we'd have really no idea. Even though the he and him changes in the middle sentence. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at by the end of verse 21. Okay? Now, 22 makes it sound like we just jump straight into Antiochus takes over and then he goes and attacks. Because it says, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown before him and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. That's just like, man, bam, all of a sudden we have this big thing going on. But actually, this verse is not like a, and now this happened. This is kind of like a title for what's going to happen over the next couple verses. So, and the reason that it says that is, when we see in verse 22 that he comes in with the arms of the flood and they are overflown before him and things like that, is the same of what happens from verse 23 all the way down to 30. It's kind of just like a subtitle, and it's like, and now Antiochus is going to do all this stuff where the end result is he goes and overflows them, and I'll explain that as in a minute, with the arms of the flood, and also the prince of the covenant. It's not like he does it immediately, but it's like, but this is going to be the result of the next 8 verses or so. So, kind of beside verse 22, we could say more of like title of the next 8 verses, so that we know that this actually doesn't happen, or this piece doesn't happen chronologically. It happens kind of, and here is what Antiochus does once he takes the kingdom, or over the next several years. So we kind of need to know who we're talking about, though, because it says, and with the arms of the flood shall they be overflown from before him. Now, as far as we can tell, this they who are overflown is the Ptolemies, the king of the south, because if you have a king of the north and a king of the south, they're gonna fight, at least once for every king, it seems like. But he's actually gonna do better than all of the other kings before. He's really gonna go and mess up the king of the south. And like it says, and they shall be broken, which they kind of are after this point in time. Antiochus really gives him a lot for. And also the Prince of the Covenant. Now this is just a tiny little note in here, but this is in reference to what is going to happen with the Jews over the next number of verses. Because not only is he going to go down and attack the king of the south, but the Jews are going to become quite heavily involved at this point in time. And there's going to be a lot of retributions against them. There's going to be a lot of violence spring up in Israel. Not just they're being trampled back and forth by king north, king south anymore, but they actually become some active players. And kind of the end result is the Prince of the Covenant is overflown, which, as far as the expositor tells us and as far as history tells us, that's the high priest of the temple at the time, the high priest of, I guess it'd be Solomon's temple. Okay, so there's kind of the lead-in to what's going to happen over the next couple of verses here. Does anybody have any questions about that? Or,
Not really a question, but I mean, this is a summary. So this is why a few days become a few years. This is why some details are left out.
Yeah.
Because it's just given the bones of what happened, so, or what was about to happen. Because Daniel's wanting to know.
That's why we have, like, the sentence, but he shall come peaceably and obtain the king by flatteries. That's the whole story of Antiochus retaking over the king of North in, like, however much that is, like 12 words. And then it's also like, this title. And he basically takes out king of the south and also the high priest in Jerusalem. It's like, whoa, that happened so quickly and there's so much history there. But like you said, it is just here's what happened. Because we're still getting to the kind of meaty part that we want to know about, that really applies to us and to Daniel at the time. Yes.
Yeah, it seems to me that when you have reference to the Prince of the Covenant or the High Priest, you're now encroaching upon what the Jews consider holy territory, which is their law keeping.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what ends up happening is Judas Maccabeus becomes sort of the hero because he is standing up for the keeping of the law. And so he's like, we can't allow these guys to take our high priest away from us or any of this stuff. We got to go to war with them, and that's when trouble begins.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And kind of from verse 23 to 27 is kind of Antiochus' fight with the king of the south. But as soon as we get to verse 28, we see this Holy Covenant referenced again. And slowly, it starts to become more and more of a theme down to verse 35, which is now we see it actually being told, and here's what's happening with the Jews. Right? And like you said, this is the first reference we've had of a covenant in this whole chapter. So far, it's kind of just been history. Now it's more of, and here's what's happening to you and your people, or what is impacting you and your people. But first, we have to kind of go through verse 23 to 27 because we have this war that starts between Antiochus and the king of the south once more. So I kind of chunked this up a bit, but it is going to go fairly quickly because I'm more concerned about getting to this piece where we talk about the land of Israel and the Jews than the exact specifics of what goes on in this war, although there definitely is some interesting points. So let's just look at verse 23 to 25. We'll read it through, and I'm guessing most of you are like me. The first time you read this through, it'll be like, I have no idea. We're going to try to fill that in a little bit. So verse 23, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and the spoil and the riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Okay, so who are the he's and hims? Because we always have to go back to the he's and hims, thank you translators, because otherwise we don't know who we're talking about. Luckily, the king of the north and the king of the south stay pretty steady in these two verses. We don't actually have them switching in the middle of the verse of who is the he and him too much. So let's start with the first part of verse 23. After the league made with him. Okay, what are we talking about here? Because we thought that the king of the north and king of the south were mortal enemies. What is this league made with him? Now, I'll give you a hint. There was a daughter given in marriage at one point in time, a little while ago. Does anybody remember what happened there? I know it's like back a little ways.
That was Cleopatra, right?
Yes, absolutely. So we have to just back up a little bit in history, because if we go back to verse 17 is where the league happens between the king of the north and the king of the south. So this is the last time that the king of the north has been down in the south. So this was Antiochus Epiphanes' dad, Antiochus the Great. If we back up, that's who we're talking about here. He shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and the upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. Okay, so this is Antiochus the Great. This is Antiochus Epiphanes' dad coming in and trying to take the king of the south, like has been done so many times throughout this chapter. But then we have a little bit of a switch. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, that she shall not stand on his side out before him. So just a weird little note, all of a sudden we have this random daughter of women come in corrupting her. And what happens here is that Antiochus the Great goes in and he tries to take the king of the south. But in the middle of that, he needs to refocus on Rome, because Rome is getting more powerful, and he doesn't really have time to actually go and fight a war with the king of the south. So he says, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to give the king of the south my daughter, they'll get married, everything will be great, we'll be family, and I won't have to fight him anymore, and I can go fight Rome. And that's exactly what happened. So he gives the king of the south at the time his daughter, and he marries her, and the king of the north, king of the south are at peace for a little while. So when we skip back down to verse 23, after the league made with him, that league made with him there is when his daughter was given to the king of the south. So actually it would be Antiochus Epiphanes' sister that was given over at that point. So if you want to, make a little note that the league and say, look back to verse 17 where the daughter of women was given, because that is the agreement that's being made. And it's about to be broken. So after the league made with him, that is with the king of the south, he shall work deceitfully. Okay, so that now we're talking about the king of the north, working deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. Okay, so now we kind of get this intro to what Antiochus is doing. So if we look at the history, what actually happens in this piece here? So what really is going on at this time is the king of the south actually wants to go and attack Antiochus. He thinks he's weak. He's just become king of the north again after retaking it over from this Heliodorus guy. And they want to go back and take control of the Holy Land that they lost so many years ago to Antiochus the Great. But Antiochus Epiphanes gets word of these preparations, and he marches his army down to Egypt, not in a "I'm going to come and fight you" sort of way, but in a "oh, I'm just coming to kind of reaffirm our covenant. I'm going to, make sure that we're still friends," all this kind of stuff, and that is this. He shall enter peaceably, even upon fattest places of the provinces. So if you look on the screen there on that map, that arrow there is the furthest extent of the King of the North Empire at that time. It's actually like pretty much right on the gates of Egypt, and it's this little town called Pelusium. So Antiochus Epiphanes marches his army all the way down pretty much to like the gates of Egypt. And is like, "I'm just here to be your friend, to reaffirm our covenant, nothing crazy." Meanwhile, knowing full well that the king of the south is going to try and march his army out and attack him and retake over this. According to description of Daniel Cls, this was done in a way that was meant to deceive the king of the south and appear peaceful. He shall work deceitfully, he shall enter into peaceably on the fattest places of the provinces. This fattest places of the provinces is this Nile Delta here. He's like right on the very edge of it, right on the fattest part of Egypt where it's the most valuable. So that's kind of where we get now. Now we're expecting this big war to happen. I'll go into that in a second. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm just going to go over here. Here.
This is very similar to what Putin's doing right now. He's coming into Syria as a peacekeeper and coming into
Yeah.
North Africa as a peacekeeper, and
Yeah.
just want to make sure everything's going to be calm and
We're just going to hold some elections and see if these are going to be consistent or not. Yeah. And when we get later in Scripture, once we get to verse 36, we switch tenor of what it's talking about in Scripture. Because we stop going from and here's the history of it, to and here's what the modern day king of the north is going to be. And like I had mentioned before, generally we base the traits of Antiochus Epiphanes, we base the traits of the modern day king of the north on the traits that Antiochus Epiphanes has and the things that he does. So like you said, absolutely, just like we would expect the king of the north to do, which is going to come down peacefully, everything's all fine and dandy. He's actually plotting war the entire time, which is a good point.
Just to add to what you're saying, when we get to between verse 36 and 40, I mentioned that, the little horn of the goat, which is the military Roman Empire and the papacy kind of together, that's not mentioned in Daniel 11. It actually is about verse 36. From those few verses bring in the development of the little horn of the goat to the time when we come to the time of the end. It brings in how that relationship between the Constantine and Constantinople and the Pope and Rome, how that all developed, and they took over all these countries, these the religious sites and everything, and then brings it down to the time of verse 40. You get back then to the king of the north between the south.
You might have mentioned this already. I was just going back to that Prince of the Covenant. It was interesting that he was murdered or assassinated about AD 70, and the establishment of the Maccabees was about, well, depending, some people say 80, 167 or 169.
AD or BC?
Sorry, I might know.
Might be BC.
Yeah, sorry, BC, I meant.
But I think as long as, or as far as the expositor goes, this Prince of the Covenant that it mentions in verse 22 is not the same one from AD 70. because this is talking about what happens with Antiochus Epiphanes, and by the time we get to AD 70, the Greeks are already gone and the Romans are in.
Yeah, I meant to say BC for both those dates.
Oh, okay, yeah.
BC 170, this covenant, Prince of the Covenant was murdered, and BC 167, the establishment of the Maccabees. So I wonder if that's a result of this Prince of the Covenant being murdered.
I think so. I'm not super clear on the history yet, but I do know that there was several overturnings of the high priest. Like for a while it kind of became like whoever was the highest bidder got to be high priest for a while. Yeah, brother.
It's, right about this time too, you can go to the First Maccabees 1 and 11, it says, in those days, there went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen, which would be Antiochus,
Yep.
that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward therein, they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen, whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to be mischief. Now when the kingdom was established before Antiochus, he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might have the dominion of the two realms, wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of joins the two stories.
Yeah, the history starts matching up from both
Yeah.
both accounts. Yeah, and like you had mentioned, when the Greeks start to do this with the Prince of Covenant and overturn the high priests and things, it starts to become whoever is going to be high priest that's most loyal to the Greeks gets to be high priest. And if you're not going to be loyal to the Greeks, you don't get to be. And if you try and take it over, we're going to bring our army in, reinstate our high priest. And the reason for that is, and I think I've mentioned this before, is that the Greeks want to subdue the Jews by Hellenization. And Hellenization is essentially like injecting Greek culture into the Jewish culture so that they become more subdued.
Another helicopter.
Another helicopter. Yeah, excellent.
Sort of a Balaam move.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
That also explains why chief priests had such a role in the crucifixion of Christ, because they were essentially in control of the nation
Mm-hmm.
under the Romans.
Yeah.
Which is a little later than what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Peace brokers.
Right. And other than the Maccabees, yeah, like exactly what you said. Yeah, other than the Maccabees, who had resisted and rebelled against the Greeks and things like that, the priests and things like that, like you said, had become the peace brokers. It's like, let's just get along with the Greeks. It'll be fine. We don't have to do too much, and that is kind of when we get to Jesus' day, why so many of them are totally against any new ways of doing things in Israel. Because stop, you're gonna upset the boat, we're gonna get into another war here. And they're very worried about that. And eventually that happens anyways when we get to AD 70 and the Romans come in and say that's enough.
And that way of thinking caused the uprising or the rebellion of the Maccabees.
Yeah.
Against it.
100%.
And that got to be so important that Herod built that temple.
Mm-hmm.
So the temple then became a peace broker in a sense too.
Right. And we'll get into this more as we go more through the chapter, but this is the point in time where we transition from what we think the law of Moses being during the Old Testament, where we're out in the wilderness and we have our tabernacle or even the Temple of Solomon, we're sacrificing, and the role of the priests is of servants. So by the time we get to Christ, it's not servants anymore. This is we have lawyers, and we have this council of priests who decide all of this religious law and all these sorts of things. And it's very different from what we see in the Old Testament. And sometimes we wonder, how did we get that big of a change? And it's during this point in time when it starts to happen, when the Greeks start to mess with all of the religious things that go on with the Jews and law of Moses. Yes,
the question to think about is, how could the crucifixion of Christ been arranged without all of this backdrop?
Yeah.
You know, it was preparing the Jews to do the unthinkable and put them in a position where they were of the mindset that would do it.
100%.
Who's this Sanhedrin that's in all this?
I don't know exactly. I don't know the history of the Maccabees too well, but I think that comes in later. Because I think so far the Jews have kind of stayed generally the same. Like, obviously the Greeks are holding that area, so there's going to be some Hellenization going on. But we don't quite yet have, like, the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all those factions yet. But they're coming soon once Israel kind of becomes the target rather than the king of the north, king of the south, just going back and forth. Ed, did you have one more?
Well, I was just gonna say, there's quite a history behind the Sanhedrin. It really starts back with the 70 elders that Moses appointed, that was kind of carried forward, but changed its, what you call it, power structure, I guess, or what they were originally delegated to do to what they afterwards became.
Okay, we don't, or we're out of time here, so I'm gonna end it there. Next, Sunday we'll go on to, now that Antiochus is like waiting for the king of the south's army, what actually happens there over the next little while, and then we'll get into what goes on with the actual plan visually. Thank you everybody for your participation. It would be not nearly as good if things were. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so much info. I'm so sorry. Okay.